Chapter 1. Foundations Built on Sand. Jack Glenn had always believed in absolutes. Black and white. Right and wrong. Loyalty and betrayal. There was no gray area in his world, just as there had been no gray area in the 22 years he'd served as a Navy SEAL. When he'd met Kristen Hatfield at a San Diego bar in 2008, her laugh had cut through the noise like a beacon. She was different from the other women who gravitated toward men in uniform. She seemed to see past the ribbons and medals to something deeper. "I don't date military men," she told him that first night, her green eyes challenging him over her whiskey sour. "Good thing I'm not asking you to date me," Jack had replied, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "I'm asking you to marry me." It had been a joke then, but 6 months later, it became reality. Kristen Hatfield became Kristen Glenn in a small ceremony at the base chapel, her flowing auburn hair crowned with her grandmother's pearls. Jack's fellow SEALs had given them a traditional sword arch, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Their daughter Leanne arrived 2 years later, a whirlwind of energy with Jack's steel-gray eyes and Kristen's infectious laugh. Jack would spend his shore leave teaching her to fish, to throw a punch, to read the weather in cloud formations. She was 8 now, and every video call from overseas showed her growing more independent, more like him. But deployments were hard on marriages, and Jack's were longer and more dangerous than most. His unit specialized in deep insertion operations, the kind where radio silence could last weeks and coming home wasn't guaranteed. Kristen had signed up for the uncertainty, but signing up and living with it were different creatures entirely. The cracks started small. Missed calls that went unexplained. New clothes that appeared in her wardrobe. A distance in her eyes during their video calls that hadn't been there before. Jack noticed everything. It was what kept him alive overseas, but he chose to believe in the woman he'd married rather than the evidence mounting before him. Terrence Marsh had moved to their neighborhood in Coronado 18 months ago. He was everything Jack wasn't. Present, available, charming in an easy way that didn't carry the weight of taking lives for country. Terrence sold luxury cars and drove a different one each week, his smile as polished as the chrome bumpers he hawked. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who showed up to school events and neighborhood barbecues with wine and compliments. At 35, Terrence had never been married, claiming he'd been waiting for the right woman. He had a way of making Kristen feel seen that Jack's intense focus somehow missed. Where Jack spoke in tactical assessments and measured responses, Terrence painted pictures with his words, making ordinary moments sound like adventures. The affair began innocently enough, or so Kristen told herself. Terrence's car had broken down, convenient, given his profession, and he'd knocked on their door asking to use the phone. Kristen had invited him in for coffee, and they'd talked for 3 hours about everything except the call he'd supposedly needed to make. After that, his visits became regular. When Jack was deployed, Terrence became the man who fixed Leanne's bike, who attended her school concerts, who made Kristen laugh until her sides hurt. He filled the Jack-shaped hole in their lives so perfectly that Kristen began to wonder if the hole had always been there, waiting for someone like him. The first kiss happened on a rainy Thursday in October, 3 months ago. Leanne was at a sleepover, and Kristen had invited Terrence over to help her fix a leaky faucet. They'd ended up on the couch with a bottle of wine, talking about dreams and disappointments. When he'd leaned in, she hadn't pulled away. By December, they weren't even pretending anymore. Terrence had a key to the house. His clothes hung in the closet next to Jack's uniforms. He picked Leanne up from school and helped with her homework, playing the role of father with an ease that Jack's rigidity had never allowed. Kristen told herself that Jack would understand when he came home, that they could have a civilized divorce, share custody, remain friends for Leanne's sake. She crafted elaborate speeches in her head, practicing in the mirror while Terrence slept in the bed she'd once shared with her husband. But Jack Glenn didn't think in terms of civilized anything. He thought in terms of mission objectives and acceptable losses. And in his world, betrayal had only one answer. Chapter 2. The Deepening Current. The lies multiplied like cancer cells, each one requiring 3 more to support it. Kristen had become an architect of deception, building elaborate structures of half-truths and misdirection. When Jack called from his forward operating base, she painted pictures of lonely nights and single motherhood, all while Terrence sat at their kitchen table helping Leanne with her math homework. "Daddy's job is dangerous," Terrence had told Leanne one evening, his tone carefully neutral. Your mom worries about him all the time. It's hard on her, being alone so much. Leanne, at 8 years old, processed this information with the brutal honesty of childhood. But she's not alone. You're here. The simplicity of it had made Kristen's stomach twist. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent fortunes in therapy trying to avoid. She was building a new life on the foundation of her old one, and sooner or later, the weight would cause everything to collapse. Terrence, for his part, had developed an unsettling relationship with Jack's absence. He'd moved through the Glen house like a conquering general, claiming territory with subtle authority. Jack's reading chair became Terrence's favorite spot for morning coffee. Jack's side of the bed was where Terrence now slept. Even Jack's relationship with Leanne was being quietly usurped, one baseball game and bedtime story at a time. Your father's been gone for most of your life, Terrence had said to Leanne during one of their heart-to-heart conversations. That must be confusing for a little girl. He was planting seeds, Kristen realized. Preparing Leanne for a reality where Jack Glenn was more stranger than father, more obligation than love. It was manipulative and calculated, but it was also effective. Leanne had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home and started assuming that Terrence would be at her next school concert. The neighborhood had noticed, of course. Regina Merritt, the retired teacher who lived next door, had watched the transformation with growing unease. She'd seen military wives before, knew the signs of marriages strained by deployment. But she'd also seen enough of life to recognize predatory behavior when it walked up and rang the doorbell. That man's got cold eyes, Regina had confided to her husband Luther. Smiles pretty enough, but there's nothing behind it. Like a shark. Luther Manning had served 2 tours in Vietnam and knew the type. Opportunist, he'd grunted over his morning paper. The kind who circles wounded families like a vulture. But knowing and acting were different things entirely. Military communities were tight-knit, but also fiercely private. What happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors, especially when one of their own was overseas fighting for his country. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when Regina was walking her dog past the Glen house. Through the kitchen window, she saw Terrence Marsh in Jack's uniform shirt, not wearing it, exactly, but holding it up to himself in the mirror, admiring the fit. The sight made her physically ill. Some things a person just can't unsee, she told Luther that evening. That man's not just sleeping in Jack's bed. He's trying on Jack's life. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Jack was leading his team through another high-stakes operation in a theater of war that didn't officially exist. The details were classified, but the toll was visible in the lines around his eyes and the way he'd started talking to himself during the long watches. His fellow SEALs had noticed the change in him. Gordon Gamble, his closest friend and second-in-command, had pulled him aside after a particularly brutal firefight. You're distracted, brother, Gordon had said bluntly. Your head's not in the game. In our line of work, that's a death sentence. Jack had wanted to deny it, but Gordon was right. His thoughts kept drifting home, to Kristen's increasingly distant phone calls and Leanne's growing comfort with his absence. Something was wrong. His instincts screamed it, but he was 8,000 miles away from being able to do anything about it. Family trouble? Gordon had pressed. Maybe, Jack had admitted. Or maybe I'm just getting paranoid in my old age. But Jack Glenn had survived 2 decades of combat by trusting his instincts. And right now they were telling him that everything he'd built, everything he'd fought to protect, was slipping away while he bled for strangers in foreign sand. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could neutralize a target from 1,000 yards, could plan operations that saved hundreds of lives, could face down enemy combatants without flinching. But he couldn't save his own marriage from the comfort of his own home because he was never actually there. As February turned to March, the distance between Jack and his family became more than just geographic. It was emotional, spiritual, fundamental. He was fighting a war on foreign soil while losing the only battle that truly mattered on his own front lawn. And in Coronado, Terrence Marsh was making his final moves to completely replace the man who'd made the ultimate mistake of trusting the wrong people with the right intentions. Chapter 3. The Call That Changed Everything. The mortar round landed 50 meters from Jack's position, close enough to rattle his teeth and fill his mouth with grit. The bunker they'd constructed from sandbags and prayers shook like a tin can, but it held. Around him, His team hunkered down as the enemy barrage continued, each explosion a reminder that death was democratic. It came for heroes and cowards with equal enthusiasm. This was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Get in, gather intelligence, get out. But simple had become complicated when they'd stumbled across a weapons cache that Intel hadn't known existed. Now they were pinned down, calling in air support, and praying that the cavalry arrived before the bad guys decided to stop shelling and start shooting. Jack's satellite phone buzzed against his chest, an impossible sound in the middle of a firefight. Protocol dictated that communication blackouts were absolute during combat operations, but the caller ID showed an emergency routing code. Someone back home was desperate enough to break radio silence. "Glenn," he answered, pressing the device tight against his ear to hear over the incoming artillery. "Sir, this is Petty Officer Martinez with Emergency Services Relay. I have the U.S. Coast Guard San Diego on the line with an urgent message regarding your daughter. Can you accept the call?" Jack's blood turned to ice water. "Leanne." Something had happened to Leanne. "Put them through." The voice that came across the line was professional but urgent. "Sir, this is Chief Petty Officer Thompson with Coast Guard Station San Diego. We have your daughter, Leanne Glenn, in our custody. She was rescued from the water approximately 1 mile offshore from Coronado Beach about 20 minutes ago." Another mortar round shook dust from the bunker's ceiling. Jack pressed himself against the wall, trying to process what he was hearing. "Is she hurt?" "She's cold and scared, but physically unharmed. Sir, she's been asking for you specifically. She says." Thompson's voice hesitated. "Sir, she says she was pushed from the pier." The world stopped spinning. Everything, the mortars, the gunfire, the war, became background noise to the roaring in Jack's ears. "Put her on." "Daddy." Leanne's voice was small and scared, but she was alive. She was alive, and that was everything. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." "Daddy, I was so scared. The water was so cold, and I couldn't swim back in." "Slow down, honey. Take a breath. Are you safe now?" "The Coast Guard men got me. They're nice." "But Daddy," her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was Terrence, Mom's boyfriend. He said if I loved you so much, I should go find your ship out in the ocean. Then he pushed me off the pier." The satellite phone creaked in Jack's grip. Around him, his teammates were returning fire, shouting coordinates, managing the chaos of combat. But Jack heard none of it. All he could hear was his 8-year-old daughter's voice explaining how the man who'd been living in his house, sleeping in his bed, playing father to his child, had tried to murder her. "Daddy, are you still there?" "I'm here, baby. I'm here. Listen to me very carefully. You stay with the Coast Guard until I get there. Don't go anywhere with anyone else. Do you understand? When are you coming home?" Jack looked around the bunker at his team, at the mission that had seemed so important 5 minutes ago, at the war that suddenly felt like someone else's problem. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." The bombing stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the sudden quiet, Jack's commanding officer, Colonel Bradley McKenzie, appeared at his shoulder. "Glenn, what's your status?" Jack looked at his CO, a man he'd served under for 8 years, a man who'd become more father figure than commanding officer. McKenzie had daughters too. He'd understand. "Sir, I need to go home. Emergency leave." McKenzie studied Jack's face, reading the devastation there like a tactical map. "What happened?" "Someone tried to kill my daughter." "And sir," Jack's voice was perfectly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. "I'm going to kill them." McKenzie was quiet for a long moment. He'd seen Jack Glenn in action enough times to know that the man didn't make idle threats. When Jack Glenn said he was going to kill someone, it wasn't a metaphor. "That's the only war that matters now," McKenzie said finally. "Go." As Jack gathered his gear and prepared for the longest journey of his life, one thought dominated his mind. Terrence Marsh had made the fatal mistake of threatening what Jack Glenn loved most. And in Jack's world, that kind of betrayal carried only one sentence. The war overseas could wait. The real war was about to begin at home. Chapter 4, Homecoming. Jack Glenn stepped off the military transport at Naval Air Station North Island at 0300 hours, 48 hours after receiving the call that had changed everything. His duffel bag contained the essentials: 3 changes of clothes, his service weapon, and a tactical knife that had saved his life more times than he could count. What it didn't contain were any illusions about what he was coming home to. The drive to Coronado General Hospital took 12 minutes. Jack timed it, noting alternate routes and potential choke points with the same automatic assessment that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Old habits died hard, and right now, he considered San Diego enemy territory. Leanne was sleeping when he arrived, small and pale in the hospital bed, for fluids replacing what the cold Pacific had stolen from her. The attending physician, Dr. Darla Abbott, met him in the hallway with a file thick enough to indicate thorough examination. "Mr. Glenn? I'm Dr. Abbott. Your daughter is physically fine. Mild hypothermia, some abrasions from the rocks, but nothing permanent. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the psychological evaluation indicates significant trauma. She's been very specific about what happened." Jack studied his daughter through the window. Even in sleep, her face was tense, troubled. "What did she tell you?" "That Mr. Marsh, your wife's friend, deliberately pushed her from the Coronado Pier. She says he was angry about something, that he'd been drinking. She also mentioned that this wasn't the first time he'd been physically aggressive with her." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Explain." Shoving, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises, verbal intimidation. Classic escalation pattern for domestic abuse. "Mr. Glenn, I'm legally obligated to report this to Child Protective Services." "Where's my wife?" Dr. Abbott's expression told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. She's been here, but she left about an hour ago. With Mr. Marsh." Jack absorbed this information like a body blow. His wife, the woman he'd married, the mother of his child, had left their daughter alone in a hospital bed to go home with the man who'd tried to kill her. "I want to see her file. Everything." "Mr. Glenn, I can't." Jack's gray eyes met hers, and whatever she saw there made her reconsider. She handed him the file. The photographs were damning. Bruises on Leanne's upper arms, finger-shaped marks that spoke of adult hands gripping too tightly. A counselor's notes about nightmares, about a little girl who'd started wetting the bed again, about behavioral changes that screamed abuse to anyone trained to recognize the signs. "How long has this been going on?" Based on Leanne's statements, approximately 3 months. "Mr. Glenn, where have you been?" The question hit like a physical blow, but Jack's expression never changed. "Overseas. Military deployment." Dr. Abbott's face softened slightly. She'd treated enough military families to recognize the impossible position that service members found themselves in, trying to protect their country while being unable to protect their own families. "I'm sorry. I know that makes this harder." "No," Jack said quietly. "It makes it easier." He spent the next hour at Leanne's bedside, watching her sleep and making plans. When she finally stirred awake and saw him, her face transformed. "Daddy." Her arms went around his neck with desperate strength, and for the first time since receiving that phone call, Jack allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had almost happened. He'd come home from war zones, from places where death was a daily companion, only to discover that the real danger had been sleeping in his own house. "I knew you'd come," Leanne whispered against his neck. "I told them you'd come for me. I'm here now, sweetheart. Nobody's going to hurt you again." It was a promise, and Jack Glenn had never broken a promise to his daughter. 2 hours later, he was standing on the front porch of the house he'd bought 8 years ago with the money from a re-enlistment bonus. The keys still worked. Apparently, Kristen hadn't bothered to change the locks. Why would she? She'd assumed he was still 8,000 miles away, playing soldier while her new life took root in the ruins of their old one. The house looked the same from the outside, but Jack could feel the difference immediately. It was subtle. Different cars in the driveway, unfamiliar shoes by the door, the lingering scent of cologne that wasn't his. Someone had been living his life, and they'd done it with casual disregard for the man who'd paid for every brick and board. Kristen was in the kitchen, making coffee as if it were any other morning. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face went white. "Jack, you're home." "Am I?" He studied her face, noting the guilt written there like a confession. "Because it looks like someone else has been living here." Terrence Marsh chose that moment to walk down the stairs, wearing nothing but boxers and a t-shirt that Jack recognized as his own. The shirt bore the insignia of Jack's unit, the one that had been pinned down by enemy fire while Jack received the call about his daughter. The two men stared at each other across the living room, sizing each other up like predators claiming the same territory. Terrence had the height advantage, maybe 2 inches, but Jack had 22 years of combat training and the focused rage of a father whose child had been endangered. "You must be Jack," Terrence said, extending his hand as if they were meeting at a cocktail party. "I've heard so much about you." Jack looked at the offered hand but didn't take it. Instead, he spoke to Kristen without taking his eyes off Terrence. "Get him out of my house." "Jack, please. Let's talk about this like adults." "Adults." Jack's voice was perfectly controlled, which somehow made it more menacing than shouting would have been. "Adults don't try to drown 8-year-old children." Terrence's confident smile faltered slightly. "Now wait just a minute. I don't know what Leanne told you, but she told me that you pushed her off a pier and left her to die in the Pacific Ocean. That's not what happened. She fell. I tried to help her, but..." Jack moved so fast that Terrence didn't see it coming. One moment he was standing by the stairs making excuses. The next he was on the floor with Jack's knee on his chest and a knife at his throat. "Jack, no!" Kristen screamed. Jack ignored her. His focus was entirely on the man beneath him, the man who tried to murder his daughter. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather instead of holding a blade to someone's carotid artery. "You're going to get dressed. You're going to leave my house. And you're never going to come within 100 yards of my family again." "You're crazy," Terrence gasped. "You can't just..." The knife pressed slightly deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. "I've killed better men than you for less cause. The only reason you're still breathing is that I don't want Leanne to lose both parents in the same week." He stood up, sheathing the knife in one fluid motion. Terrence scrambled backward, hand pressed to his throat. "Get out," Jack said simply. Terrence looked to Kristen for support, but she was staring at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the man she'd married, the one who'd been careful never to bring the war home with him. This was the soldier she'd only heard about in whispered conversations between other military wives, the one who eliminated threats without hesitation or remorse. "Kristen." Terrence's voice was plaintive, desperate. "Go," she whispered. "Just go." After Terrence left, the house felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if a poisonous atmosphere had been cleared. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. Terrence Marsh had tried to kill his daughter, had violated his home, had seduced his wife into betraying everything they'd built together. In Jack's world, those were capital offenses. And Jack Glenn had never believed in plea bargains. Chapter 5. Intelligence Gathering. Jack spent the first week back home like a soldier conducting reconnaissance in enemy territory. He moved through his own house with careful observation, cataloging every change, every intrusion, every piece of evidence that told the story of his family's dissolution. Terrence had been thorough in his invasion. His clothes still hung in the master bedroom closet next to Kristen's dresses. His shampoo sat in the shower beside Jack's and used bottles. Most insulting of all, family photos had been rearranged, some turned face down, others moved to less prominent positions, as if Jack's presence in his own home had been relegated to supporting character status. But Jack was nothing if not methodical. He documented everything with the same precision he'd once used to plan military operations. Photographs, timestamps, detailed notes. Building a case not for any court of law, but for the court of his own judgment. Kristen moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding direct confrontation but unable to hide her guilt. She'd started sleeping in the guest room without being asked, and their conversations were limited to logistics about Leanne's care and Jack's transition back to civilian life. "I know you hate me," she said on the fourth night, finding him in his study reviewing financial records. Jack looked up from a stack of credit card statements that told their own story of betrayal. Dinners at expensive restaurants, hotel charges, purchases at jewelry stores. All while he'd been eating MREs in a foreign desert. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "Hate requires emotional investment. Right now, you're just evidence." The coldness in his voice made her shiver. "Jack, I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen. And now Leanne is traumatized. My home has been violated, and my marriage is over." He set down the statements and looked at her directly. "The only question now is what I'm going to do about it." Kristen wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller than he remembered. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Terrence Marsh tried to murder my daughter. And you enabled him." "I didn't know." "You knew enough." Jack stood up, his presence filling the small room. "You knew he was hurting her. Dr. Abbott showed me Leanne's medical records. The bruises, the psychological evaluations, the behavioral changes. You knew all of it, and you chose him anyway. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Kristen opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. They both knew the truth. Where is he now? Jack asked. I don't know. He's been staying at a motel since you came back. Jack nodded. He'd already discovered that himself through methods that would have impressed his former intelligence colleagues. Terrence was at the Pacific Vista Motel on Orange Avenue, room 237, paying cash for weekly rates. He'd been making phone calls to Kristen every few hours, calls that she'd been taking in hushed whispers when she thought Jack wasn't listening. But Jack was always listening. 22 years in special operations had taught him that information was the ultimate weapon, and right now he was collecting it with the patience of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. Regina Merritt next door had become an unexpected ally. The elderly woman had approached him on his 5th day home, bringing a casserole and a story that filled in crucial gaps in his intelligence picture. I should have called someone, she confessed over coffee in her kitchen. But I didn't know who to call or what to say. Military wives. Well, we're taught to handle things ourselves. She told him about the months of watching Terrence's car in the driveway, about seeing him answer the door in Jack's bathrobe, about the night she'd witnessed him screaming at Leanne in the backyard, close enough that she'd been tempted to call the police, but the child had gone inside before she could act. He's got a mean streak, Regina said. Hides it well, but it's there. Your little girl was scared of him, Jack. I could see it in the way she'd flinch when he raised his voice. Jack absorbed this information like pieces of a tactical puzzle, each detail adding to his understanding of the enemy's patterns and weaknesses. Because that's what Terrence had become in Jack's mind. Not a romantic rival, not a mistake that could be forgiven, but an enemy combatant who had targeted his family. And Jack Glenn had become very good at neutralizing enemy combatants. Gordon Gamble called on the 7th day, checking in from their forward operating base. How's the home front, brother? Complicated, Jack said, which was military speak for completely fucked, but I'm handling it. Need backup. The offer was genuine. Gordon would be on the next transport home if Jack said the word, and he'd bring friends. The Brotherhood of Special Operations ran deeper than blood, and threatening one man's family was threatening them all. Not yet, Jack replied. But I'll let you know. Roger that. Just remember, we don't leave men behind, and we don't let threats to the family go unanswered. After ending the call, Jack sat in his study looking at the photographs of Leanne's bruises, at the credit card statements showing Terrence's expensive tastes, at the evidence of a man who had systematically destroyed everything Jack held sacred. In the military, there were rules of engagement, protocols for dealing with enemy combatants, legal frameworks that governed the use of force. But Jack wasn't in the military anymore. He was a father whose child had been hurt, a husband whose marriage had been destroyed, a man whose home had been invaded. And in his world, the real world, the one where 8-year-old girls got pushed off piers, there was only one rule that mattered. Protect your own, by any means necessary. Terrence Marsh was about to learn what it meant to threaten the family of a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of war. Chapter 6, Opening Moves. The psychological warfare began on a Tuesday morning with something as simple as a flat tire. Terrence discovered it when he left the Pacific Vista Motel for his morning jog, a routine that Jack had observed and cataloged with military precision. 2 tires, actually, slashed with surgical accuracy in a way that suggested professional expertise rather than random vandalism. When Terrence called the auto club, he was told there would be a 3-hour wait. When he called a taxi, he found that all the local companies were experiencing unusual delays. By the time he managed to get replacement tires, he'd missed his appointment with a potential client, a deal worth $15,000 in commission. Jack watched from a rental car parked 3 blocks away, taking notes on Terrence's increasingly frustrated phone calls. Phase 1 of his operation was about disruption, making his target's life systematically more difficult without leaving evidence that could be traced back to him. The next day, Terrence's credit cards were mysteriously declined at 3 different establishments. When he called the companies, he was told there were computer glitches that would require 24 to 48 hours to resolve. His bank account showed a temporary hold on funds due to suspicious activity patterns that required in-person verification. By Thursday, Terrence was paying for everything in cash and looking over his shoulder constantly. He'd started making paranoid phone calls to Kristen, asking if Jack had said anything about him, if there had been any unusual activity around the house. He's just trying to scare me. Terrence told Kristen during one of their hushed conversations that Jack monitored through equipment that didn't officially exist, trying to get me to leave town. Maybe you should, Kristen replied, her voice strained. Maybe we both should. This isn't healthy for anyone. Run away? Let him win. Kristen, I love you. I love Leanne. This is our life now, not his. The possessive certainty in Terrence's voice told Jack everything he needed to know about his target's psychology. This wasn't a man who would be scared away by flat tires and credit card problems. This was a predator who viewed Kristen and Leanne as his property, who saw Jack as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a husband wronged. That assessment changed Jack's tactical approach considerably. On Friday, Jack paid a visit to Terrence's workplace, Premium Automotive Sales, a high-end dealership that catered to clients with more money than sense. He didn't go as himself. Instead, he wore an expensive suit and carried credentials identifying him as Robert Martinez, a private investigator working for a law firm. I'm conducting a background check on Terrence Marsh, he told the sales manager, Alfonso Herring, a nervous man with sweat stains and a guilty conscience. Standard employment verification for a potential position. Can you tell me about his work history here? Herring was eager to cooperate, perhaps too eager. Terry's one of our top salesmen. Great with customers, especially the ladies. Knows how to make them feel special. Any disciplinary issues? Problems with coworkers? Well, Herring glanced around the showroom, then leaned in conspiratorially. There was that incident with Beverly Edwards from accounting. Sexual harassment complaint. But we handled it internally, you understand. No need for lawyers or formal charges. Jack made notes, his expression neutral. What kind of incident? Unwanted advances, inappropriate touching. Beverly was pretty shaken up about it, but Terry convinced her it was all a misunderstanding. Charming guy, you know? Women usually like his attention. Usually? There was another situation with a client's wife, Caitlin Robinson. Her husband bought her a BMW for their anniversary, and Terry got a little too friendly during the delivery process. The husband threatened to sue, but again, we worked it out quietly. Jack continued taking notes, building a profile of a man who saw women as targets rather than people. A pattern of predatory behavior that had been covered up by employers who valued sales numbers over employee safety. Has Mr. Marsh ever been violent? Herring's expression darkened. There was an incident last month. He lost a big sale to one of the other guys. Customer decided to buy from Jesse Matthews instead. Terry threw a wrench through Jesse's windshield in the parking lot. We had to pay for the repairs and give Terry a final warning. Final warning? Any more violent incidents, and he's gone. Of course, his sales numbers are so good that management's been willing to overlook a lot. Jack thanked Herring for his time and left with a much clearer picture of his target. Terrence Marsh wasn't just an opportunistic homewrecker. He was a violent predator with a history of escalating behavior. Men like that didn't respond to subtle pressure. They responded to superior force applied with overwhelming precision. That evening, Jack found Kristen in the kitchen making dinner for Leanne, who was finally starting to show signs of recovery from her ordeal. The 8-year-old had been staying close to her father since his return, as if his presence created a protective barrier against the world's dangers. We need to talk, Jack said quietly. Kristen glanced at Leanne, who was absorbed in her homework at the kitchen table. Not here. They moved to the back patio, where Jack laid out his intelligence like a briefing for a military operation. Terrence's employment history, his pattern of harassment and violence, his escalating behavior with women who rejected his advances. You need to understand what you brought into our home, Jack said, his voice clinical and precise. This isn't a man who made a mistake or had a moment of weakness. This is a predator who targeted our family deliberately. Kristen's face went pale as she processed the information. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. Jack leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face. But ignorance doesn't excuse what happened to Leanne. What are you going to do? What I've been trained to do, Jack said simply. Eliminate the threat. The words hung between them like a death sentence, and Kristen suddenly understood that she wasn't just watching the end of her marriage. She was watching the beginning of something much darker. Jack, you can't. I can, he interrupted. And I will. The only question is whether you're going to help me or stand in my way. Looking into her husband's gray eyes, Kristen realized that the man she'd married, the careful, controlled soldier who'd always been so precise about keeping his war separate from his home, was gone. In his place sat someone much more dangerous, a father with nothing left to lose. Chapter 7. The Hunt Begins. Jack's war against Terrence Marsh escalated from psychological harassment to something far more personal on a Monday morning when he discovered that his target had made contact with Leanne. The school called at 1,047 hours. Jack had started thinking in military time again, a sure sign that he'd shifted into combat mode. Principal Francisca Carson's voice was carefully controlled, but Jack could hear the underlying concern. "Mr. Glenn, there's been an incident involving Leanne. Can you come in immediately?" Jack arrived at Coronado Elementary 12 minutes later to find his daughter sitting in the principal's office, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. The story she told made Jack's blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. Terrence had been waiting in the parking lot when school let out, positioned near the buses where he couldn't be seen from the main office. He'd called Leanne over, told her that her mother was sick and had sent him to pick her up. When Leanne had refused and started walking toward her regular bus, he'd grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave marks that were already visible through her sleeve. "I remembered what you said about strangers," Leanne told Jack, her voice small but steady. "Even strangers who aren't strangers." So I screamed really loud and kicked him in the shin and ran to Mrs. Carson's office. Mrs. Carson had immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, Terrence was gone. The incident had been recorded, statements taken, but Jack knew how these things worked. Without witnesses or security footage, it would be Terrence's word against an 8-year-old's, and men like Terrence were very good at manipulating the system. "The police want to speak with you," Mrs. Carson said. "Detective Luther Manning is waiting in my office." Detective Manning was a 20-year veteran with tired eyes and the kind of mustache that had gone out of style in the 80s. He looked up when Jack entered, taking in the rigid posture and controlled fury with professional assessment. "Mr. Glenn, I understand you've been deployed overseas. When did you return?" 8 days ago. "And you're aware of the relationship between your wife and Mr. Marsh?" "I'm aware." Manning made notes, his expression neutral. "Your daughter's given us a detailed statement about today's incident, as well as the earlier incident at the pier. These are serious allegations, Mr. Glenn." "They're not allegations. They're facts. The problem is proving them." Mr. Marsh claims today was a misunderstanding, that he was concerned about Leanne walking home alone and was trying to offer her a ride. He denies grabbing her or making any threats. Jack's jaw tightened. "And the pier incident?" He maintains that was an accident. Says Leanne slipped and fell while they were fishing, that he immediately called for help. Manning closed his notebook. Without witnesses or physical evidence, it's a difficult case to prosecute. So he gets away with it. "I didn't say that. We're pursuing the investigation, but these things take time. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest keeping your daughter close and documenting any further contact." After Manning left, Jack sat in his car outside the school for a long time, thinking. The legal system was designed to protect the innocent, but it also protected predators who knew how to work within its constraints. Terrence had experience manipulating women, manipulating employers, manipulating situations to his advantage. He would use those same skills to manipulate the legal system. But Jack Glenn hadn't spent 22 years learning to work within legal constraints. He'd learned to work around them. That evening, he put Leanne to bed early and found Kristen waiting for him in the kitchen. She'd heard about the school incident from Mrs. Carson and looked like she'd been crying. "This has to stop," she said without preamble. "He's escalating. First the pier, now this. What's next?" Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and studied his wife's face. "You tell me. You know him better than I do." "I thought I did. But the man I was with, he was charming, gentle, romantic. He never showed me this side. Because you weren't an obstacle to him. You were the prize." Jack sat down across from her. "But now I'm back, and Leanne's rejecting him, and his perfect little fantasy is falling apart. Men like Terrence don't handle rejection well. What are you going to do?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before my first deployment?" he asked finally. Kristen frowned, confused by the change of subject. "That was 12 years ago, Jack. You said, 'Come home to us. No matter what it takes, no matter what you have to do, just come home to us.'" Jack looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. I kept that promise, Kristen. Every mission, every firefight, every time I had to make impossible choices, I thought about you and Leanne, and I found a way to come home. Jack. But now I'm home, and the war followed me. It's in my house, threatening my daughter, destroying everything I fought to protect. He stood up, his movements controlled but predatory. So I'm going to end it the same way I ended every other war I've fought. What does that mean? Jack looked at her for a long moment, and Kristen realized she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time in their marriage. Not the careful, controlled man who'd hidden his darker nature behind uniforms and protocols, but the soldier who'd done whatever was necessary to complete his missions and come home alive. It means Terrence Marsh is going to disappear, Jack said simply. And when he does, everyone's going to assume he just moved on to easier prey, including you. Kristen stared at him, understanding the implications but unable to process them fully. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about eliminating a threat to my family. Jack finished his coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink with methodical precision. The only question is whether you're going to help me or get in my way. I won't be part of this. You already are. Jack's voice was matter-of-fact, without anger or judgment. The moment you brought him into our home, the moment you chose him over Leanne's safety, you became part of this. The only choice you have now is whether you're on my side or his. After Jack left the kitchen, Kristen sat alone in the dark, thinking about the man she'd married and the man she'd betrayed him with. She'd thought Jack was cold, distant, emotionally unavailable. She'd never considered that his careful control might be the only thing standing between his family and the kind of violence he'd perfected in service to his country. Now that control was gone, and Kristen was finally seeing the warrior she'd married. Not the sanitized version that came home on leave, but the one who made the hard choices that kept his family safe. And she was terrified to realize which version she respected more. Chapter 8. The Deep End. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of National City had been closed for 3 years, a casualty of the recession and changing shipping patterns. To most people, it was just another piece of urban decay, the kind of place that drug addicts and homeless camps avoided because even desperation had its limits. To Jack Glenn, it was the perfect operational theater. He'd spent 2 weeks preparing the space with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to forward operating bases in hostile territory. Sound-dampening materials salvaged from construction sites, plastic sheeting that could be easily disposed of, tools that had been purchased with cash from different stores across 3 counties. Most importantly, he'd established multiple exit routes and disposal protocols that would leave no traceable evidence. If this operation went sideways, Jack would disappear into the California underground as completely as any ghost they'd created in foreign countries. But this operation wouldn't go sideways. Jack had planned it with the same attention to detail that had made him one of the military's most effective special operations soldiers. And unlike his previous missions, this one was personal. Getting Terrence to the warehouse required exploiting the man's fundamental weakness, his inability to walk away from a challenge to his dominance. Jack had orchestrated it through Kristen, feeding her the script that would draw their target into the perfect killing ground. He's been asking me to meet him, she told Terrence during one of their monitored phone calls. Says he wants to talk about a civilized divorce, about custody arrangements. I think he's finally accepting that it's over between us. That doesn't sound like the man who held a knife to my throat, Terrence had replied, suspicious but intrigued. Maybe he realizes that fighting me will just hurt Leanne more. You know how military men are about their orders and protocols. Maybe someone above him told him to stand down. It was brilliant psychology, Jack had to admit. Kristen had pushed exactly the right buttons, appealing to Terrence's ego while offering him the victory he craved. The man who tried to drown an 8-year-old girl couldn't resist the chance to gloat over the soldier he'd defeated. Where does he want to meet? Some warehouse in National City. Says it's neutral ground, private enough to talk without neighbors listening in. Kristen had delivered the address with just the right amount of reluctance, as if she were betraying a confidence. I don't like it. Sounds like a trap. Terry, he's a military man. They don't do ambushes in civilian life. They have too much respect for rules and proper procedures. Besides, what's he going to do? He can't hurt you without going to prison, and then Leanne would lose both her father figures. The appeal to Terrence's narcissism had worked perfectly. He'd agreed to the meeting, convinced that his superior understanding of Jack's military mindset would protect him from any potential violence. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. Jack arrived at the warehouse 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, conducting final preparations with the calm focus of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Everything was ready: the soundproofing, the tools, the disposal protocols. All that remained was the arrival of his target. Terrence pulled up exactly on time, driving the silver BMW he'd been using to charm clients and seduce wives. He stepped out of the car looking confident, almost cocky, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Glenn," he called out as he approached the warehouse entrance. "Let's get this over with. I've got better things to do than waste time on your wounded ego." Jack opened the door, standing in the shadows where Terrence couldn't see his face clearly. "Come in. We need privacy for this conversation." The warehouse interior was dimly lit by work lights that Jack had positioned to create pools of illumination separated by zones of darkness. It gave the space an theatrical quality, like a stage set designed for a particularly violent play. "Jesus, what is this place?" Terrence asked, his confidence wavering slightly as he took in the industrial emptiness. "Neutral ground," Jack replied, closing the door behind them. The sound of the lock engaging echoed through the empty space with finality. "Look, I know you're upset about Kristen and me, but we're all adults here. She made her choice, and—" Jack hit him from behind with a blackjack, dropping him to the concrete floor with surgical precision. Not hard enough to cause permanent brain damage, but hard enough to ensure compliance. When Terrence came to, he was zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the warehouse, the work lights creating a perfect interrogation setup. Jack sat across from him, cleaning his fingernails with the tactical knife that had saved his life more times than he could count. "What the fuck is this?" Terrence demanded, struggling against the restraints. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping, assault. I'll have you arrested." "No, you won't," Jack said calmly, not looking up from his knife. "Because after tonight, you won't be around to file any complaints." The casual certainty in Jack's voice cut through Terrence's bluster like a blade through silk. For the first time, he began to understand that this wasn't intimidation or psychological warfare. This was an execution. "You're crazy. You're actually fucking crazy." "Maybe," Jack acknowledged, finally looking up. 8 months of combat deployment will do that to a man, especially when he comes home to find that someone's been hurting his daughter. "I never hurt Leanne. The medical records say otherwise. Bruises, psychological trauma, behavioral changes consistent with ongoing abuse." Jack stood up, moving closer. "And then there's the pier incident. Pushing an 8-year-old into the ocean and leaving her to drown. That was an accident." "No, it wasn't." Jack's voice was matter of fact, like a teacher correcting a student's math error. "It was attempted murder. And in my world, people who try to kill children don't get second chances." Terrence began to panic, struggling against the zip ties with increasing desperation. Kristen will call the police when I don't come home. Kristen thinks you decided to leave town. She got a text from your phone about an hour ago, saying you couldn't handle the pressure anymore and were moving back east to start over." Jack held up Terrence's phone. "Amazing what you can accomplish with the right equipment. You can't get away with this. People will look for me. People look for lots of men who disappear in San Diego. Most of them are never found." Jack returned to his chair, studying Terrence with clinical detachment. "Tell me about the other women." "What other women?" "Beverly Edwards, Caitlin Robinson, all the others you've harassed, assaulted, manipulated." Jack consulted a notebook filled with his intelligence gathering. "I've been building quite a file on you, Terrence. You're what we call a repeat offender. I never. You threw a wrench through a co-worker's windshield because he outsold you. You sexually harassed an accountant badly enough that she filed a complaint. You've been arrested twice for domestic violence, though the charges were dropped when your victims mysteriously changed their minds." Jack looked up from his notes. "Men like you are why men like me exist." Terrence was crying now, the confident facade completely shattered. "Please. I'll leave town. I'll never contact Kristen or Leanne again. I'll disappear." "Yes," Jack agreed. "You will." The tactical knife moved with surgical precision, finding the exact pressure points that would cause maximum pain while avoiding major arteries. Jack had learned these techniques in classified training programs, methods designed to extract information from enemy combatants who thought they were stronger than their interrogators. Terrence screamed, the sound absorbed by the warehouse's soundproofing like water into sand. That was for the bruises on my daughter's arms, Jack said conversationally. This is for the nightmares she's been having. The knife moved again, and Terrence's screams became something beyond human language. And this, Jack said, positioning the blade over Terrence's carotid artery, is for pushing her off that pier. The final cut was quick, clinical, merciful only in its efficiency. Terrence Marsh died as he had lived, as a predator who had finally encountered something higher up the food chain. Jack spent the next 2 hours cleaning up with the same methodical precision he'd applied to the killing itself. By dawn, there would be no trace that Terrence Marsh had ever been in the warehouse. By noon, there would be no trace of Terrence Marsh at all. As he prepared to leave, Jack thought about his daughter sleeping safely in her bed, no longer afraid of the monster who had tried to drown her. He thought about the other women Terrence would never hurt again, the children who would never know the fear that Leanne had experienced. In the military, they called it collateral benefit, the positive outcomes that resulted from completing a mission successfully. This mission was complete. Chapter 9, High Tide. 6 months later, Jack Glenn sat on the deck of his new house overlooking Mission Bay, watching his daughter Leanne practice casting her fishing line into the calm water. She'd gotten good at it, her technique improving with each session, her laughter carrying across the water like music. The old house in Coronado had been sold, the proceeds split in the divorce settlement that had been finalized with surprising speed. Kristen had moved to Phoenix to live with her sister, claiming she needed a fresh start away from the memories. She called Leanne twice a week, maintaining the relationship but accepting that primary custody would remain with Jack. I can't fight you, she told him during one of their final conversations. And I can't live with what I know. Jack had understood. Kristen was a good woman who'd made bad choices, but she wasn't strong enough to live with the reality of what those choices had required. Some people could compartmentalize violence when it served justice. Others couldn't bear the weight of necessary cruelty. The official story was simple and believable. Terrence Marsh had grown tired of the complications in San Diego and moved back to his hometown in Ohio to start over. His disappearance had been noted but not investigated. After all, men left town all the time when relationships became too complicated. His car had been found at the Greyhound station with a note explaining his decision to travel light and start fresh. The car dealership had been mildly inconvenienced by his sudden departure, but Alfonso Herring had seemed almost relieved. Always was a little too intense, he told anyone who asked. Probably better off somewhere else. Detective Luther Manning had made a few perfunctory inquiries when Terrence failed to appear for a scheduled interview about the Leanne Glenn incident, but the case had been administratively closed when the primary suspect disappeared. Manning had bigger problems to worry about than a harassment case involving a man who'd apparently left the state. Regina Merritt had been the only one to express real concern about Terrence's sudden departure. Seemed like the type who'd stick around to cause more trouble, she told her husband Luther over their morning coffee. Men like that don't usually just walk away. Maybe he finally met someone who convinced him it was time to go, Luther had replied, glancing meaningfully toward Jack's new house. Military men understood each other, even across generational lines. Jack's transition to civilian life had been surprisingly smooth. The Navy had processed his early retirement with minimal questions, understanding that family emergencies sometimes required difficult choices. His pension and disability benefits provided enough financial security to focus on being a full-time father, though he'd started doing some consulting work for private security firms that needed his particular skill set. Gordon Gamble had visited twice, each time spending long hours on the deck with Jack, drinking beer and talking about everything except the obvious. Military brotherhood ran deep, and men who'd served together understood that some conversations were better conducted in silence. You seem settled, Gordon had observed during his most recent visit, watching Jack and Leanne working together to repair a fishing net. I am, Jack had replied simply. Good. Some wars are worth fighting. Some wars are necessary. They'd left it at that, understanding passing between them like a frequency only soldiers could hear. Leanne had thrived in the months since Terrence's disappearance. The nightmares had stopped, the behavioral problems had resolved, and she'd begun to flourish under Jack's patient attention. They'd established routines built around fishing trips, homework sessions, and quiet evenings when she'd tell him about her day while he prepared dinner. "Dad," she said now, reeling in her practice cast with improved technique. "Mrs. Carson wants to know if you'll speak to her class about the military." "What would I tell them?" "About being brave, I guess. About protecting people." Jack considered this, watching his daughter's face in the golden afternoon light. She'd grown older in the past 6 months, not just physically but emotionally. The innocence that Terrence had tried to steal from her was gone, but in its place was something stronger, a quiet confidence that came from knowing her father would always protect her. "Being brave isn't about not being scared," he said finally. "It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are scared. Like when you came home from the war to help me." "Exactly like that." Leanne nodded, processing this with the serious consideration she brought to everything these days. "Will you do the presentation?" "If you want me to." "I do. I want everyone to know that my dad is a hero." Jack looked out over the water, thinking about the choices he'd made and the prices he'd paid. Hero was a complicated word, especially when applied to actions that couldn't be discussed in polite company. But if his daughter felt safe, if she could sleep without nightmares and laugh without fear, then perhaps the label didn't matter. "We should head in," he said, noting the sun's position. "Dinner won't cook itself." As they packed up their fishing gear, Leanne chatted about school and friends and plans for the weekend. Normal 8-year-old concerns, the kind she'd been too scared to have when Terrence had been in their lives. Jack listened with the patient attention he'd once applied to intelligence briefings, understanding that these conversations were just as important as any military mission he'd ever undertaken. That night, after Leanne was asleep, Jack sat on his deck with a beer and a secure satellite phone, making his weekly check-in with Gordon. "Status report?" Gordon asked, using their old operational protocol. "All quiet on the home front," Jack replied. "Target neutralized, civilians safe, mission parameters exceeded. Any ongoing threats?" "Negative. Situation stable, indefinitely." "Copy that. Anything else you need?" Jack looked through the sliding door at his daughter's bedroom, where a nightlight cast gentle shadows on walls decorated with fishing trophies and school certificates. 6 months ago, that room had belonged to a frightened child who wet her bed and jumped at unexpected sounds. Now it belonged to a little girl who dreamed about fishing trips and science projects. "Negative," he said. "All objectives achieved." After ending the call, Jack remained on the deck for a long time, listening to the gentle sound of water against the shore. In the distance, he could see the lights of Naval Base San Diego, where young sailors were preparing for deployments that would take them far from home in service to their country. Jack had served his country for 22 years, and he'd served it well. But his most important mission had been saving his daughter from a predator who'd invaded their home. That mission had required skills the Navy had taught him and moral flexibility that civilian life wasn't supposed to demand. He'd made his choice, and he'd live with the consequences. But watching Leanne practice her casting that afternoon, seeing her laugh without fear or hesitation, Jack knew he'd made the right choice. Some battles were fought for abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. Others were fought for the right of 8-year-old girls to feel safe in their own homes. Jack Glenn had fought both kinds of battles, and he'd won them all. The tide was high, and all was well. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.